With a diameter of 1.4 meters and nearly 4 kilometers long, the tunnel leads directly to the Tsar's Hunt, where Russian soldiers plan to launch a surprise attack and encircle the units of the 110th Brigade. For nearly a month, Russian forces secretly cleared the old sewer pipe. And so, on January 17th, about 150 elite soldiers from the 60th Assault Brigade were sent through the pipe. Submerged in waist-deep icy water and in inhumane conditions, the Russians, meter by meter, cleared a path through the cast-iron pipe. The Russian soldiers emerged and attacked the Ukrainian troops, who were completely surprised and overwhelmed by the situation. The Russian forces managed to break through the Ukrainian defenses. This battle continued for several days until January 20th, when Russian troops finally captured the fortified restaurant of the Tsar's Hunt and advanced north along Soborna Street. The Ukrainian 110th Brigade suffered heavy losses during these agonizing days of battle. Then, on January 22nd, the Ukrainians reported fighting in the northern and western parts of the city, even near the coke plant. Combat footage of kamikaze drone attacks from the 110th Mechanized Brigade show that Russian troops had entered urban areas. And thus, on January 23rd, Russian forces had finally reached west of Stepave. February arrived, and this month would become the decisive and final month of the battle for Avdivka. On the 1st, the Russians advanced in Vesely, pushing back the outnumbered and outgunned Ukrainians as defenses began to crumble all along the front line. This was mainly due to a severe deficit of artillery ammunition, a shortage of men, and continuous bombardments by the Russian army. Also, the surprise attack through the pipe in January was the final straw that irremediably tipped the balance in favor of the Russians and diverted the last Ukrainian reserves in the area. On February 2nd, the Russians advanced further from the north, beginning to open an alarming wedge between the city and the Avdivka coke plant. The Ukrainians, who had already run out of reserves, were quickly defeated in many positions, as the offensive had a snowball effect. Russian forces had captured most of the Dacha area northeast of the city, advancing several hundred meters along the wooded area of the lake north of Sopronova Street, reaching the northernmost segment of Donetska Street. And so on February 8th, the Russians capture a substantial portion of the city, continuing with determined attacks, with the dual objective of further separating the plant from the city, as well as cutting off Avdivka's main supply line. They also captured a section of the railway line and part of a summer house neighborhood through it. Russian troops were concentrating their attacks on the northern axis in an attempt to cut the main supply highway. By this point, the situation was shaping up to be one of the worst military disasters Ukraine had faced since the early months of the war. In just 1 week, Avdivka, with its enormous number of buildings and remnants of formidable fortifications, destroyed by bombs and artillery, went from being a firmly controlled city to a series of pockets with Ukrainian troops trapped inside. Furthermore, just as the battle entered its most critical phase, key changes were made to the Ukrainian military command. That same day, February 8th, the commander of Ukraine's ground forces, Colonel General Alexander Syrskyi, replaced General Valery Zaluzhny as commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine. Faced with the challenge of saving the situation in Avdiivka, Syrskyi decided to rapidly deploy the Ukrainian 3rd Assault Brigade, one of the most numerous, experienced, and battle-hardened brigades, right into the eye of the storm to buy time and prevent the encirclement. Meanwhile, by February 10th, the Russians managed to cross the train tracks in Avdiivka, while the Ukrainians continued to fall back. The wedge near the Tsar's Hunt also expanded, as Ukrainian troops began a withdrawal to avoid being encircled. At the same time, a catastrophe was also brewing at another Ukrainian fortified position called Zenit, based on the old air defense base. The Russians, no longer restricted by Ukrainian artillery, which was practically out of ammunition, and with their infantry constantly retreating, advanced again from Opitne and began to close a very tight pocket. In this context, on February 12th, the Ukrainian 3rd Assault Brigade arrived in force and quickly took over the positions of the exhausted 116th Mechanized Brigade at the Avdiivka coke plant. Upon its arrival, the brigade organized tactical assaults, mainly in a 2-kilometer wide corridor through which the 110th Brigade and others had to retreat in their fight for survival. On February 13th, the coke plant was subjected to an intense bombardment with FAB glide bombs to try and reduce it to its foundations, this being the largest bombardment on the coke plant to date. The 3rd Brigade reported that the Russian Air Force was dropping 60 bombs daily on Ukrainian positions throughout the city, without resistance from the Ukrainian army. That same day, the Russian army achieved one of its most important objectives, reaching Industrial Avenue, also called the Road of Life. This completely cut Avdivka in two. Russia managed to separate the Ukrainian troops at the coke plant from the rest of their forces in the city, leaving them completely isolated. The next day, from the northern axis, the Russian army took control of the forested area between the coke plant and the water treatment facilities. In addition, the troops crossed Industrial Avenue and began to advance along the forest belt to its southwest, which is located 1.4 kilometers from the Ukrainian army's last supply route to the city and 3.8 kilometers from the Russian troops on the southern front. Ukrainian forces began to withdraw from the Avdivka quarry landfill and from the summer cottage community in Verba. That same day, some units of the 110th Mechanized Brigade were pushed out of Avdivka because they no longer had sufficient capabilities to hold the city. The 110th Brigade had defended the city non-stop since March of 2022. While all this was happening in the north, in the south, things were going from bad to worse. For Ukraine, to be able to get the troops out of the Donetsk filtration station, it was necessary to maintain control over the positions. Zenit positions located at the military base of a former Ukrainian air defense unit and the fortified Chebarashka junction, which at this point were almost completely surrounded. The flanks of Zenit collapsed when Opitne was previously captured, and after the Russian tunnel operation in early January. After weeks of fending off sniper and machine gun attacks from 3 directions, the order was finally given to retreat north and escape the encirclement. For the Ukrainian army in the city of Avdivka, this was the beginning of the end. On the night of February 14th to the 15th, groups of troops from the already exhausted 110th Ukrainian Brigade began to withdraw to the north of the Zenit Chebarashka defensive complex and toward the 9th district of Avdivka. Under the cover of night, the Ukrainians began to withdraw from Zenit in small groups along the only available path. As the Ukrainian troops fled on foot in total darkness across hundreds of meters of open field, sometimes getting lost, they suffered notable casualties from intense harassing fire from Russian artillery, mortars, and machine guns, which caused them to abandon some of their severely wounded comrades in the open. The soldiers of the 110th Mechanized Brigade, under artillery fire and facing skirmishes with Russian forces on their flanks, suffered heavy losses. In a second attempt, the Ukrainians outside the pocket tried to extract the trapped soldiers with armored vehicles. But the route was too dangerous, as the Russians were practically closing the pocket by the end of February 15th. By February 16th, Russian troops had also captured the Chebarashka fortification on the Donetsk Ring Road, north of Zenit, finally taking the long-held defensive complex. Little by little, the entire Ukrainian defense in Avdiivka was collapsing. Russian soldiers raised flags at the filtration station, and the Ukrainian troops were completely driven out. The station was one of the powerful fortified zones of the armed forces of Ukraine in the southeast of Avdivka. That same day, the Russians launched all their forces against the wedges in the Ukrainian defense to capitalize on the breakthroughs, as they could clearly see that the Ukrainian forces were retreating. Russian troops advanced along Cherbeskabo Street in a southeastern direction, while house-to-house fighting continued in the northeastern part of the city, with the most intense combat in the city's industrial district. By nightfall, the Russians had captured Avdivka's city park in the center, as well as the nearest hospital. Reports also came in of new advances in the south, in the Vinogradniki Gardening Association, in the industrial area south of the coke plant. Faced with the difficult situation and the devastating Russian strikes, the 3rd Brigade began a desperate retreat from the coke plant on February 16th. While evacuating the plant, they destroyed sensitive materials at their command post, such as maps, orders, shift schedules, personal documents, and handwritten notes with coordinates. The Russians increasingly tried to disrupt the Ukrainian withdrawal with targeted artillery and drone strikes. Around that time, a Ukrainian soldier with the call sign Major recalled that during the final retreat along the last road out of Avdivka, everything was a disaster. This soldier, in his own words, called this road the Road of Death, and he expressed it in his own words. The evacuation convoy in front of me was hit by Russian artillery, completely wiping out a convoy with the best Ukrainian soldiers, right before my very eyes. By February 17th, Oleksandr Syrsky officially announced that Ukrainian forces were withdrawing from Avdivka. President Zelensky confirmed that the decision to withdraw was to save the lives of the Ukrainian soldiers from the Russian encirclement. In any case, the loss of the plant left the Ukrainians with no other option but to retreat to a new, weaker defensive line in Berdichi, Orlovka, and Toninkhe. The Russians also concentrated significant forces in the area of the coke plant, which was finally captured by February 18th. During the day, several videos appeared showing Russian flags planted throughout the city, including on one of the coke plant buildings, on a chimney of the quartz plant south of the flooded quarry, and on the city administration buildings and the Palace of Culture. Later that day, the Russian Ministry of Defense declared that Russian forces had taken control of Avdivka and that cleanup operations were underway at the coke plant. Thus, the Battle of Avdivka ended with the victory of the Russian army. The fall of Avdivka marked one of the most significant moments in the course of the war since the capture of Bakhmut. For Russia, this victory not only represented a territorial advance, but also a symbolic blow after a long period of Ukrainian resistance in the stronghold. Avdiivka was one of Ukraine's main defensive bastions in Donetsk, from where the positions of the Donetsk People's Republic were constantly harassed. Its capture symbolized for Moscow the dismantling of a deeply entrenched enemy enclave dating back to the year 2014. For Ukraine, the defeat in Avdiivka represented a painful loss, both militarily and symbolically. In summary, the battle for Avdiivka was not just another battle, it was a turning point that showed a shift in momentum in the conflict, demonstrating that the war had entered a new phase where Ukraine was struggling to contain Russian troops, while Russia regained the tactical initiative in eastern Ukraine. At the same time, it exposed the growing logistical, human, and strategic difficulties of the Ukrainian forces.